In a village where the earth had swallowed every prayer for rain, Favour clutched the last cup from a dying river, and a broken stranger at midnight was begging for it all. We meet Favour, a young woman whose hands know only labor and whose heart still fights against the cynicism choking her village. Led by Elder Danjuma, a man who measures worth in what can be hoarded, the community has become a graveyard of locked wells and guarded cisterns. The air taste of dust and desperation, establishing brutal stakes from the first breath. Water isn't charity here, it's the line between tomorrow and an unmarked grave. Favour's day began the way all her days began, on her knees, scrubbing Elder Danjuma's courtyard stones with water so precious it should have been drunk, not spilled. Her fingers bled into the cracks. No one mentioned it. The elder watched from his chair, counting his jars. 12 clay vessels, each sealed with wax and locked behind iron. He'd buried 3 more somewhere only he knew. In a village where mothers chose which child would drink, Danjuma had enough water to bathe. "You'll go to the river tonight," he said, not looking at her. "Midnight. Fill 1 cup. No more." Favour's stomach tightened. The river was nearly dead, a trickle that appeared only under moonlight, and even then, barely enough to wet your tongue. But worse than the scarcity was the work itself. The woods between the village and the water had grown strange. People who went alone sometimes didn't come back the same. 1 cup, she repeated. "And Favour," his voice dropped. "If I hear you wasted even a drop on sentiment, you'll learn what real thirst feels like." She nodded, though her chest ached with something she couldn't name. Once, this village had shared. Once, her mother had sung while she worked. Now the songs were gone, and the only sound was the scrape of hoarded jars being moved in the night. As the sun bled into the horizon, Favour sat outside her small hut and watched the dust rise like ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, a child cried, not from hunger, but from watching his sister's portion poured back into a sealed container. This was the world Elder Danjuma had built. A world where kindness was theft, and mercy was suicide. And tonight, Favour would walk into the dark alone. The moon hung like a bone in the sky. Favour's feet found the path by memory, though her heart hammered with every step. The woods were awake, she could feel it. Trees that had stood silent for months now seemed to lean closer, their branches scraping messages she couldn't read. Her cup, tied to her waist with fraying rope, felt heavier than it should. She'd heard the stories. A farmer who'd returned from the river speaking in riddles. A young mother who came back without her bucket, claiming the water had whispered her name. Elder Danjuma dismissed them all as heat madness, but Favour had seen their eyes. They'd seen something. A twig snapped behind her. She froze, pulse wired. Slowly, she turned, but there was nothing. Just shadows pulling between the trees like spilled ink. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself. "Just water. Just 1 cup." But the air had changed. It tasted electric, wrong. And somewhere ahead, beneath the rustle of dying leaves, she heard it, a sound like breathing that wasn't hers. The path narrowed. Thorns caught her skirt. She pushed through, and suddenly the trees opened up, and there it was, the river. Except it wasn't a river anymore. It was a scar in the earth, a thin silver thread barely moving, reflecting the moon like a dying eye. And kneeling beside it, drinking from cupped hands, was a woman Favour had never seen before. The stranger's hair was matted. Her clothes hung in racks. And when she lifted her head, her eyes were so hollow they looked like they'd been crying for years. "Please," the woman rasped. "Do you have water?" Favour's hand moved instinctively to her empty cup. The question hung in the air like smoke. Favour should have run. Every instinct her village had beaten into her screamed the same warning: strangers at midnight mean death, and sharing means you die faster. But something in the woman's face held her still. Favour's voice cracked. "I haven't filled my cup yet." The woman nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. Her hands trembled as she lowered them from her cracked lips. "Then I'll wait." "Wait for what?" "For you to decide." The words made no sense, but Favour knelt anyway, dipping her cup into the river. The water barely covered the bottom, a mouthful, maybe 2. It took 3 attempts to gather even that much. When she finally stood, the liquid gleamed in the moonlight, impossibly precious. The woman's eyes followed the cup like a dying woman watching her last hope walk away. Favour's throat was dry as sand. She'd been rationed a single sip this morning, Danjuma's orders. This water was supposed to last her 2 days. If she gave it away, she'd be drinking her own saliva by dawn, and the elder would know. He always knew. "What's your name?" Favour asked, stalling. "Ruth." "Where did you come from, Ruth?" The woman smiled, but it was the saddest thing Favour had ever seen. "From the place people go when they are forgotten." Favour's hands shook. The cup felt like it weighed 100 stones. In the village, Elder Danjuma would be checking his jars, counting his wealth in liquid ounces. He'd never given anything away in his life. He called it wisdom. Survival. And he was still alive. But Favour's mother had shared her last piece of bread with a neighbor's child, and she died 2 winters ago with a smile on her face, whispering that some things mattered more than breathing. Favour looked at Ruth, really looked. Saw the exhaustion, the resignation, the faint flicker of something that might have been hope once. She held out the cup. "Here." Ruth stared at the offering like it was a language she'd forgotten how to read. "You're giving this to me?" "Before I lose my nerve," Favour whispered. The woman's fingers closed around the cup, and for a moment, their hands touched. Ruth's skin was cold, impossibly cold, like she'd been dead for hours. But her grip was gentle, reverent, the way you'd hold something sacred. She drank. Not desperately, not greedily. She drank the way someone drinks when they're trying to remember what it feels like to be cared for. When the cup was empty, she handed it back, and her eyes were wet. "You don't know what you've done," Ruth said quietly. "I know I'll be thirsty tomorrow." "No." Ruth shook her head, and something in her voice had changed, deepened. "You won't." The air around them began to hum. Favour stepped back, her pulse spiking. The moonlight seemed brighter suddenly, sharper, and Ruth's shadow on the ground had started to move independently, stretching and shifting like something alive. "What?" "Shoo." Ruth stood, and as she rose, her rags began to shimmer. The tears in the fabric sealed themselves. The dirt fell away like a discarded skin. And beneath it all, her true form began to emerge, not flesh, but light, ancient and utterly other. Favour's breath caught. This was no beggar. No lost traveler. This was something the earth itself had sent. But before Ruth could speak again, a voice shattered the silence, a voice Favour knew too well, thick with fury and cold triumph. "So, Elder Danjuma stepped from the trees, his face twisted with rage. "You've chosen treason." He wasn't alone. 3 men flanked him, all loyal, all armed with sticks meant for dogs. And in Danjuma's hand, glinting in the moonlight, was a chain. "I told you," he hissed, advancing, "not to waste a single drop." Favour's legs locked. Her mind screamed at her to explain, to beg, but her voice had fled. Danjuma raised the chain. And Ruth, no longer trembling, no longer small, smiled. "You followed her," Ruth said softly. "How unfortunate." The elder froze. "For you." Danjuma's face darkened. "I don't take orders from beggars." "Then don't." Ruth's voice was calm, but the river behind her had started to tremble. The thin thread of water began to widen, slowly, impossibly, as if something beneath the earth had just woken up. "But you will answer for what you've built here." The elder laughed, sharp, ugly. "What I've built? I've kept this village alive. While fools like her," he jabbed a finger at Favour, "waste resources on strangers, I've ensured survival. That's leadership." "No," Ruth said, stepping forward. The ground beneath her feet bloomed with pale grass that shouldn't exist. "That's theft. You've hoarded what was meant to flow. You've locked away life itself and called it wisdom." Danjuma's hand tightened on the chain. "Enough riddles. Seize her." The 3 men hesitated. One of them, a younger farmer named Oak, stared at the grass now spreading around Ruth's feet, his face pale. "Elder," Oak whispered, maybe we should. Now. They moved, but Ruth simply raised one hand. The river exploded. Not with violence, but with presence. A column of water rose behind her, silver and roaring, and within it, images flickered like memories, the village as it had been, green and laughing. Wells overflowing. Children playing in streams. And then the slow death, the hoarding, the locks, the fear. All of it reflected in the water's surface like a judgment. The men stumbled back, terrified. But Danjuma stood his ground, fury burning brighter than fear. You think you can scare me with tricks? He turned to Favour, his eyes venomous. This is your doing. You brought this curse here. She brought mercy, Ruth corrected. Something you've forgotten exists. Danjuma spat. Mercy is for the dead. Then let's see what you're willing to die for. Ruth's form solidified fully now, tall, regal, draped in robes that seemed woven from moonlight itself. Her voice carried the weight of centuries. I am the keeper of the waters. I withdraw the rains when hearts turn to stone, and I return them when even one soul remembers what it means to pour yourself out for another. She looked at Favour, and her expression softened. This girl gave her last. She chose another's test over her own. That is the key. That has always been the key. Danjuma's face twisted. Then I take it from her. He lunged, not at Ruth, but at Favour, the chain whipping through the air. But he never reached her. Ruth's hand moved, a single gesture, and the elder's voice died mid-scream. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He clutched at his throat, eyes wild with panic and rage, but no sound emerged, not a whisper, not a gasp. Silence. Perfect, eternal silence. You wanted to control the narrative, Ruth said quietly. Now you spend the rest of your days unable to speak a single word of it. Danjuma fell to his knees, clawing at his throat. And the river began to sing. The water didn't just rise, it returned. It poured from the earth like a confession, filling the riverbed, spilling over the banks, racing toward the village with the sound of 1,000 apologies. The dry ground drank desperately, cracks sealing, dust turning to mud, and then, green. Shoots of grass pierced the soil, unfurling in seconds. Favour stood frozen, watching the impossible become real. Ruth turned to her, and the light around her began to soften, pulling inward. You were the test, Favour. And you passed. I don't understand. You will. Ruth stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch Favour's forehead. The contact was warm now, alive. The drought was never about rain. It was about hearts. When a people forget how to give, the earth forgets how to provide. But you, her voice filled with something like pride, you remembered. I couldn't let her suffer. Favour's voice broke. Even if it was stupid. It was the opposite of stupid. It was holy. Behind them, Danjuma right on the ground, his silent screams visible only in the contortion of his face. The men who'd followed him had fled, crashing through the trees back toward the village. What happens to him? Favour asked quietly. Ruth glanced at the elder without pity. He'll live. But he'll never command again. His voice was his weapon, now it's gone. Let him learn what it's like to be powerless. To need mercy and have no words to beg for it. Favour felt something shift inside her, not satisfaction exactly, but a grim kind of justice. And me? Ruth smiled. You've been given a gift. The same one I carry. Every word you speak with true kindness will manifest as something the world can see. Blessings for those who bless others. Your voice will become creation itself. I don't. Try it, Ruth urged. Speak something kind. Mean it. Favour hesitated, then looked at the river, now rushing and full. She thought of her mother. Of the neighbor's child who'd received that last piece of bread. May this water reach every home that's forgotten what it tastes like, she whispered. The air shimmered, and from her lips, a single golden coin fell, landing in the grass. Then another. And another. Each one warm, solid, real. Favour gasped. The more you give, Ruth said gently, the more you'll be able to give. But remember, it only works when your heart is true. Greed will turn the gold to dust. Favour stared at the coins, then at Ruth, then at the river singing its way back to life. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought was dead. Hope. By dawn, the village was in chaos. The river had reached the wells overnight, flooding cisterns that had been dry for months. People stumbled from their homes, disbelieving, clutching buckets and jars, weeping as they filled them again and again. Some fell to their knees. Others simply stood in the water, letting it soak their clothes. But when they asked who'd done this, who'd brought the miracle, the answers all pointed to one name: Favour. She walked through the center of the village as the sun rose, Ruth beside her, though to the villagers, Ruth appeared only as a kind traveler, her divine form hidden. Danjuma's men had already spread the story, garbled and frightened, but the core truth remained: Favour had given her last cup to a stranger, and the stranger had been something holy. Elder Danjuma himself sat slumped outside his compound, voiceless, broken. His jars of hoarded water had cracked in the night, spilling their contents into the ground. He tried to stand when Favour approached, tried to speak, but only a strangled rasp emerged. Favour looked at him for a long moment, and perhaps this is where listeners who've walked this far with her might pause, hearts heavy with the weight of choice, wondering what they would do if they held such power. The kind of pause that asks, would you forgive? Would you crush? And in that silence, maybe you felt it too, the pull of this story, the way it mirrors something true. If you have, I'm grateful you're still here. Favour knelt beside the elder. You taught me that mercy was weakness, she said quietly. But you were wrong. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and though her heart still carried the bruises of his cruelty, she spoke the words anyway. May you one day understand what you've lost. A single pearl formed in her palm, milky white, flawless. She set it in the dust before him and walked away. Behind her, Danjuma stared at the pearl, something in his chest cracking. The days that followed reshaped everything. Favour spoke blessings over the sick, and flowers bloomed from her words, petals that, when brewed into tea, healed fevers. She whispered hopes for the children, and their laughter became visible as ribbons of light that wrapped around the village like protection. Every act of kindness she named aloud became real, tangible, impossible to deny. The people began to call her the river's daughter. Elder Danjuma, meanwhile, became a ghost in his own home. He couldn't command, couldn't threaten, couldn't hoard. Without his voice, his power dissolved like salt in water. The men who'd once obeyed him now ignored him, stepping around him as if he were furniture. He'd built a tower of fear, and it had collapsed in a single night. Favour saw him sometimes, sitting in the market, watching her with hollow eyes. She didn't gloat, didn't punish him further. But she didn't help him either, not yet. Some lessons, Ruth had told her, take time to sink in. Instead, Favour focused on rebuilding. She gathered the women, those who'd been silenced, rationed, beaten down by scarcity, and taught them what Ruth had taught her, that wealth wasn't what you kept, but what you gave. That a village survived not by locking resources away, but by letting them flow. One evening, as she sat by the river, Ruth appeared beside her. You've done well, the spirit said. I don't feel like I have. Half the village still looks at me like I'm dangerous. You are, Ruth said, smiling. You're dangerous to everything they've been taught. That's how change works. Favour looked at the water, now clear and steady. Will you stay? Ruth shook her head gently. My work here is finished. But yours is just beginning. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You gave away your last cup of water to a stranger in the dark. You're stronger than you know. And with that, Ruth began to fade, not dying, but returning, dissolving into the river itself until only her voice remained, a whisper in the current. Remember, Favour, true wealth is shared. Then she was gone. Favour sat alone, the night settling around her. But she wasn't afraid. It happened 3 nights later. The sky had been clear, stars sharp as broken glass, and then, without warning, the air changed. It thickened, sweetened. And from the east, clouds rolled in like a long-held breath finally released. The first drop hit Favor's cheek as she stood outside her hut. Then another. Then the sky opened. Rain. Not the weak drizzle of mercy, but a downpour, huge, drenching, alive. It hammered the roofs, filled the gutters, turned the streets into rivers. People ran outside, screaming with joy, arms outstretched, faces turned upward. Children danced. Elders wept. The spiritual drought hadn't just broken. It had shattered. Favour stood in the center of it all, soaked to the bone, laughing and crying at once. Around her, the village transformed, grass pushed through the mud, trees straightened, flowers split the earth. The land was remembering how to live. And in the midst of the celebration, she saw him. Elder Danjuma, standing in his doorway, rain streaming down his face. He wasn't celebrating. He was staring at his hands, hands that had hoarded, controlled, stolen. Hands that now held nothing. Their eyes met across the flooded street. For a moment, Favour considered walking away. He'd earned his isolation. His silence. But then she remembered the pearl. The one she'd left for him. The one that had said, "You can still learn." She walked toward him. He flinched, as if expecting a blow. But Favour simply stood before him, rain pooling between them, and extended her hand. "It's not too late," she said. His mouth opened, silent, useless. But his eyes spoke what his voice couldn't. "I don't deserve this." "No," Favour agreed. "You don't. But neither did I, and someone gave me water anyway." She waited. And slowly, trembling, Elder Danjuma reached out and took her hand. The rain fell harder, washing everything clean. Months passed, and the village became unrecognizable. The wells overflowed. The fields turned green. Trade routes reopened as word spread of the miracle, the place where the rain had returned, where a young woman spoke blessings into being. Favour didn't call herself a queen. But the title found her anyway. She used the treasures that fell from her words, gold, gems, pearls, to build what Danjuma had destroyed, communal wells, shared granaries, a school for children who'd forgotten what it meant to dream beyond survival. She taught them the lesson Ruth had taught her, the one that had saved them all. True wealth is shared. Elder Danjuma never regained his voice. But he regained something else, his hands. He worked now, quietly, in the fields he'd once taxed to starvation. He carried water to those who couldn't walk. He built fences, repaired roofs, and when children ran past him laughing, he didn't scowl. He smiled. It was small. Fragile. But it was real. One evening, as the sun set over the river, Favour sat on the bank, feet in the water. The current was strong now, steady, singing the song Ruth had left behind. A shadow fell beside her. She looked up to see Danjuma, holding a single cup of water. He offered it to her, no words, because he had none, but the gesture said everything. Favour took it. Drank. And when she handed it back, she saw tears on his weathered face. "You're forgiven," she said quietly. He closed his eyes, and the tears fell harder. Later, as the stars emerged, Favour stood alone at the river's edge. She thought of Ruth. Of her mother. Of every person who'd chosen kindness when the world demanded cruelty. And she made a promise, to herself, to the river, to the sky. She would never forget the price of a cup of water. Or the value of giving it away. Behind her, the village glowed with lamplight and laughter. Ahead, the river flowed eternal, carrying stories downstream to places that still needed to remember. And Favour, the river's daughter, the queen who gave everything away, stood between them, a bridge between what was and what could be. If you've traveled this far with her, if you've felt the weight of her choice and the light of her mercy, then maybe you've learned what she learned, that the truest power isn't in what we keep, but in what we are willing to pour out. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. The river is still singing. Are you ready to hear it again?